This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew. Welcome to the Craft Beer and Brewing Podcast. I'm your host, co-founder and editorial director of Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine, Jamie Bogner. This is episode 227 of the podcast. We are coming to you again from Belgium. Joining me again on this episode is my co-host, managing editor Joe Stang. Joe.
Hey.
Yeah. And we are sitting in the living room of Tom Jacobs of Antidoot here in, what town are we in, Tom?
It's called Kortenaken.
Kortenaken.
Yeah, it's just the east of Flemish Brabant.
It's a beautiful home with a brewery right here on site and orchards, grapevines, trees, fruit trees, goats, sheep, a very natural setting where you are producing, even on your own property, a lot of the ingredients that you're pushing into your own beer, brewing beer with a very connected to the earth approach, doing it with alternate ways, maybe not using hops as much as some other brewers might, focusing on using herbs, brewing deeply with herbs, and then building beers that come from the ingredients that you grow yourself. We're going to talk about how you do that, how you formulate ideas, what that creative process looks like. We're going to go deep into your philosophy on brewing, because you have a philosophy background on that. But we're also going to talk about constructing flavor out of ingredients in a different kind of way, a different typical approach than brewers might otherwise do. Before we do that, for nearly 30 years, G&D Chillers has set the mark for quality equipment you can rely on. G&D stands above the rest as the only chiller manufacturer that engineers your glycol piping for free. G&D also stands alone as the only chiller manufacturer with an in-house team of installers and engineers with 30 years of real-world field labor experience in breweries, wineries, and distilleries. Contact the Total Glycol System Design experts today at gdchillers.com. Also, support for this episode comes from BSG. Did you know that BSG sources hops directly from growers and processes them in their FSSC certified facility in the Yakima Valley? From Azaka to Zappa, BSG's hops are pelletized for optimal dispersion in the boiler, or FV, and packaged in nitrogen-flushed bags to preserve all of those tasty and enticing aromatics. To learn more about how your hops go from farmer to fermenter, get in touch with BSG at letstalkhops@bsgcraft.com. So, Tom, let's start this off the way we normally do, talking about your history, background in beer. What path you took to get here and launching your own brewery here at your home?
I think it's now 12 years ago. Me and my wife, we were living in Leuven, which is like a small student city, like 30 minutes from here. But we were looking for a place to live, to buy a house, and we were a bit like tired of, say, city life and the type of consumption that comes with it. Say the supermarket life. So we were looking for a place with a bit of space where we could just grow our vegetables on, keep some animals. So it was an idea of more self-subsistent life. And then we came here just like totally the east of Flemish Brabant, which is a really like still rural area with a lot of fruit growing. And we found this like old house, and we said like, this is perfect for what we want to do. We still didn't have any plans about brewing, but that came pretty quickly after when we were installed here. I used to drink beer, but just not as a beer geek. I was just I think mostly drinking Orval. I think that was my main to-go beer, and something like the Black Label Girardin beer. That was standard. And just me and my brother said, okay, let's try to make some beer. I think home brewing wasn't really popular back then, but we just found some information, small cattle, and that's how we started. But then in the beginning, like, we started actually with doing, in Belgium, everyone was still drinking triples. So I think that was the first beer. But after a while, we started adding Orval dregs to the beer, and then all the beers, after a while, they tasted a bit the same. It was interesting, but we wanted also to get to have some acidity in the beer. And I think one of the defining moments in what we wanted to do, that was we went to a festival in Holland. The Molen Festival was one of the bigger international festivals that started happening. And we tasted some of the beers of Jester King. And we were big lovers of say, the Belgian, say, farmhouse beers. But after a while, a lot of these beers, they're too triple-like. Let's say they're too acid, like Saison du Pont. It gets heavy. It's too much banana. And it lacked a bit the acidity that we were looking for. So we wanted to do, like, ideally we had something in our mind, like, so between Lambic and those farmhouse. And that was just what we discovered, like, American breweries started doing, like Jester King. And that triggered us. So we wanted to get more this acidity in it without being too acidic.
Right.
So because some of the classical lambics back then were, for us, too acidic, like many of the Hansen beers. And then we found this in between, these possibilities. We had sometimes we used to buy too old Blogy. Bière d'Arbiste, which is just too old. And it was just like, it was just in the shop for like €1 a bottle because it's out of date. And that had that acidity. It's probably an infection, but that's not important.
Right.
That's not the point. They didn't have the plan to have that acidity, but if you would leave it a few years in a bottle, it would get there. And then we decided, like, if we want that, we need to have some barrels. And then we started with just because we just had a small installation, so we couldn't deal with big barrels. So we started buying new small barrels, 30 liter, 50 liter. But then it was too oaky. And so it needed a lot of time, and then even afterwards it was still too oaky. So we decided, like, we have to get, like, used wine barrels if we want just to make our beer like we want to have it. And then actually it started getting out of hand.
Right, if you're brewing enough beer to fill up wine barrels,
we
can't drink that much beer, can you?
No, but we had a system that we had. We started with 25 liters system, and we went to 50 liter. But then we had a 100 liter kettle, and then we could brew, let's say, 75 liters. So we would need to brew 3 times to fill a barrel. But then we started developing a kind of Solera system. Like every 9 months, we would get 75 liters out of a barrel and divide it over different demijohns with different fruits to experiment with. But then we could just, with one brew session, we could fill the barrel again, and we just could keep it going. But after a while, we started filling too many barrels, and we also started filling some barrels with cider. And then we had to decide what to do with it, because it's too much to drink it all ourselves or to keep it going like that. And then we decided about 5-6 years ago, like, no, we want to take it to another level.
And so you just, because you were homebrewing so much, it just became a business then.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's still, because when you're here, it's still homebrewing.
It still is homebrewing. You're right.
It's just,
we're in your home, and the brewery is right there.
Yeah. And it's the same. Just the system is 10 times bigger.
Yeah.
But it's all the same.
Yeah. Yeah. As you decided to then become, take a more, well, I shouldn't even call it a business approach, because this is still very much a, creative driven process, and the beers that you make are still driven, not just, hey, how much can we sell, but, but driven out of that kind of creative vision. How when you decided to then become a business, how did that change your approach, or what did you then decide to add to your approach to brewing?
I don't think it's changed that much, because I think I agreed from the beginning with my brother. So we started the operation together as a 2-person, business. But my brother still has a full-time job as a doctor in a hospital, so that he would assist like 1 day a week. I would do all the rest of the stuff. But we agreed from the beginning that we would only do things that we would also do as a non-professional home brewer. So would only let us guide by the principles of our own taste or what we want to do and keep all the freedom. So from the beginning, we decided to stay small. That's very crucial because otherwise we cannot do it all ourselves anymore. Right. You have to more look into like how the market works. And we hope that it would work, that if we would stay small enough, we would not need to care about the market at all. That we just hope like, okay, this is what we do. Let's hope we find a market for this, and it might work when we stay small enough.
Yeah.
That was the idea.
Yeah.
And I'm very happy that till now we can just stick to that philosophy.
Yeah. So now 100% of your beer is spontaneously fermented, cool shipped. Yeah. Well, not necessarily spontaneously fermented.
We'll discuss maybe.
It's definitely cool shipped.
Yeah.
Were your homebrew beers also all cool shipped before that too, or is that?
I can show you some pictures of how we did it. No, it went in different phases, of course. Yeah. I already told you about adding your Valdrags. We tried many different approaches, but let's say the years before we started with the brewery, we focused on capturing wild yeasts, and there are different ways to capture it. Cool shipping is one way to do it. So we had we put a 25-liter kettle outside at different places in the vineyard. We put also the vine cuttings we would lay over the small kettle. But actually we had the best methods when we just would... we made different, like small wort samples where we would select different elements from the garden to put into see how we can grow some cultures out of that. So we had some good results with some of the
bring the flowers and fruits into your wort samples rather than taking your wort out to the garden.
And then I think at the moment we started, we had two or three different wild captures, but we don't have a laboratory. We never.
I'm shocked.
Yeah. And it was too difficult to keep them separate because you have to keep feeding it, and so it morphed actually all into one house culture that we somehow still use, but it's of course not the same version because it goes through all the transformations. It goes through all the cool shipping, and if we want to get it going, we always activate some yeast also at bottling stage because we want a quick re-fermentation when we bottle it. So that's my brother's tasks. So he will use some of the most recent fermentation and then add some wort to it, fresh wort, to activate it for a few days, and then we'll use that as a starter when we bottle.
Yeah. I want to talk about that.
That is pretty consistent.
Yeah, I want to talk more about that process. I also want to, I want you definitely don't call what you do lambic, for obvious reasons, because, but also some philosophical ones. I want to talk about that too. But first, are you looking for innovation in your next beverage breakthrough? Think outside the puree box and let your brand stand out with Old Orchard's craft concentrate blends. Even smoothie seltzers can benefit from the extra boost of flavor and color. Old Orchard is based in the greater Grand Rapids, Michigan area, also known as Beer City, USA, and supplies craft beverage categories ranging from beer, wine, and cider to seltzer, spirits, and kombucha. To join the core of Old Orchard's brewing community, learn more at oldorchard.com/brewer. Also, Brew Monitor from Precision Fermentation is the first real-time comprehensive fermentation monitoring solution. It works with your existing fermentation tanks to track dissolved oxygen, pH, gravity, pressure, temperature, and conductivity in real time from any smartphone, tablet, or PC. Brew Monitor provides detailed insight into your fermentations that helps improve beer consistency, reduce tank time, and increase overall efficiency, saving your brewery time and money. Get started for 30 days risk-free. Visit precisionfermentation.com/brewing. So, Tom, you brew spontaneously, but you also at times use your culture that you've developed and integrate that into the fermentation in specific ways, sometimes not. You definitely don't call it lambic, and you're not in the Pietonland. You're over here on the the east side of Belgium, and so that certainly would create some arguments among diehards in that film. But it's, I think, bigger than that for you, isn't it? For the reason you wouldn't tie it into that definition.
Yeah, I think if you look at the process, it's pretty similar. Let's say 9 out of 10 times we also brew, say, our blonde beer, which is in process and in malt composition is very similar to lambic. Also the use of aged hops in the beginning of the boil, the cool shipping. But for us, we had some discussions about it in the beginning, just before we started. It's like, is this lambic? Do we want to call it lambic? And the main idea is like we didn't care too much about the legal issues, but the main concept was like we want to keep our freedom, not just in the way we produce it, but also in the way we think about our products and the way we want other people to think about it. Because we see always it's very hard for everyone actually to appreciate things without a concept. But just to say with an open view or an open mind, just to approach things. But if you directly give people a concept, they will just have the question in their head like, is this lambic or is this not lambic? But that's not for us the interesting question. The question is, do you like to drink this? Even if you don't know what it is or what it should be. It's not that it should be something. It only should be good. But it should not be like conform to some principles that you already have in your head. That's the same if people say wine tasting. Like if you say like this is Pinot Noir and they will say like no, this doesn't taste like Pinot Noir. Okay, but it's not such an interesting question. Of course, if it conforms to all that concept, and that for us it's really important. I think it works also. That's why we never use any style categories. It's not only not the lambic, but even not. I will sometimes say like saison or farmhouse and so, but we even don't use those style categories. Not at all. Like on our labels, we describe the process, and then we hope that people will think themselves about it. Like, okay, this is how we did it, and I think that works for us. It works because it's like we have never anything on keg. Like for example, we never end up with our beer in a craft beer bar where people have to choose between 30 beers on keg, and then you need like, okay, that's a double IPA, that's a porter. Then you need some kind of style category. Our hope or ambition was that people would be able to recognize that beer as Antidoot. So even if we come out with say 25 different beers in a year, that somehow through all those beers you will say, oh, okay, this is with herbs or this is with fruit, but I get the Antidoot profile.
I think it would be really interesting to hear you describe for us what that is. What is an Antidoot style beer? And then I have maybe as a kind of question that could be part of that. You have interesting views on Brettanomyces, unexpected, I would think, based on the wild captures and the spontaneous side of it. And I think it would be interesting to hear about that too, and how that presence or absence also is part of the profile.
It's not that I can directly like describe the profile, but it's always like, for me, it's like my wife, she's not directly involved in the process, but she's involved, let's say, in the tasting. And I often let her taste like blindly samples. Also, when I open other bottles from other people, I always let her taste blindly. And she's mostly like, okay, this is an Antidoot. And I hear it also from a lot of her members. There's like, yeah, it has this typical Antidoot profile. Yeah, it's hard to describe. It's closely connected to the water profile, I guess, because it's still the main ingredient. I think we're pretty high in natrium. We also have quite some of the other minerals in the water. It's groundwater from here in the area, from pretty deep. Then there's probably we always aiming. So there's this mineral side connected to the water, but that's a given somehow. What we're after always is to make, I wouldn't call them sour beers. It's a category I don't like so much because it's too one-dimensional. If you call a beer sour, it's not about being sour, but we always aiming for some acidity. We want beers to have a good acidity. So it's always like a specific kind of acidity that we're after. Like we don't like the quick acidification through lactobacillus. It gives a more one-dimensional acidity to beer, like the more, let's say, Berliner Weisse or the lemonade kind of acidity. But prefer a long, slow acidification. It's probably through pediococcus. And we want to avoid acetic acid at all costs. It's the same with wines. I really hate high volatile acidity. The acetone flavors, or a sharp acidic aftertaste. Like we would try to avoid that at all. So if we notice some of that, we'll destroy the batch, we destroy the barrel. We don't mind blending it in. We don't want to ruin any other stuff with it.
Sure.
For us, it's very strict. It's important.
Right.
That's about the acidity. So we want to have it a good acidity, but it has to be very drinkable.
Right.
So we're always looking for drinkability. That's actually a main issue.
Calling beer sour is like calling a dish at a restaurant a salty dish.
Yeah.
Because every restaurant, uses incredible amounts of salt. It's one component. Of the
It's
flavor.
one component,
But it shouldn't define the entire thing.
It should be totally in the balance with the other things. You need the acidity just to make it drinkable.
Yeah.
But if it's too high, it's not drinkable anymore.
Yeah. When it comes to that acidity, you have you embrace bitterness with that in a way that a lot of other brewers that brew acid forward beers, maybe aren't as fond of.
Yeah.
But it doesn't bother you. You are comfortable and in your wheelhouse blending acidity and bitterness. Talk to me a little bit about that.
Yeah, the general idea is a bit in the beer world that it clashes.
Right.
And I've never understood it that much. Maybe, of course, it's the same with acidity. We have to talk about different kinds of acidity. There are also different kinds of bitterness. And we found mostly, because we never use hops as so much for the bitterness. Of course, we have some hops that we use early in the boil that will also contribute to the bitterness. But the more, say, firm bitterness that we have sometimes comes from the herbs, which is, I don't see it clashing, but it's just like it gives them a long finish. So the bitterness mostly comes at the end when you swallow, and the acidity you have more directly, like more upfront or in the mid. So I don't really see that clash. It just, it provides some structure to the beer.
Yeah.
It provides some more depth and roundness when you have that. So I think somehow it needs that.
Right.
You also have it in some lambics, like some Girardin. There's also just like bitterness.
And it works well. I think we were talking before we started the podcast that there's almost that cocktail element to it that and you can find your most popular drinks in Italy, for example, that combine those bitter flavors with sweeter fruit flavors. And you see the same thing happening in, with cultures, spontaneous cultures that develop these fruity flavors, these Brettanomyces driven, flavors that are very fruit forward. And that bitterness, it's not conceptually at odds with, balancing with those kinds of prominent citrus flavors.
It's maybe as a kid, I grew up just in Belgium. We have Belgian endives, which is a typical bitter. It was one of my favorite vegetables. And also, I remember as a kid, I was never into, say, Coke or Sprite, which is just way too sweet. I would only drink bitter lemon. I don't know if that's known in the United States. Bitter lemon.
No,
it has a very bitter lemonade for kids. It's like tonic, so it also contains quinine,
right?
But as a kid, I remember I would always go for that. So that grapefruit kind of sour bitterness thing, and I think just it now goes also. I try to do that with the beers.
Yeah. You mentioned a second ago that taking an herbal approach to bitterness can maybe time shift that experience of bitterness, as people drink a beer.
Yeah.
Talk to me a little bit about, some of the herbs that you use specifically for that kind of approach to bittering, and, how you might describe some of the bitterness that they create, or even the textural sensation of bitterness, or the time sensation of when you tend to taste it. I'm curious about that, because that's an interesting way to think beyond, in a multidimensional way about bitterness itself.
I'll try to describe, but it's always very difficult.
Sure. And as I say that, we were nibbling on some wormwood earlier, and it's still lingering in my mouth, and so I still have this, this feeling of bitterness, this lingering taste of bitterness with me.
Yeah, I will maybe say something shortly about, say, the two main herbs that we use for bittering. And there are two herbs that were very popular in the European 19th century tradition of liquors. I think it's probably somehow in the time of Groot, a lot of these herbs were used, and then hops took over. But that whole tradition, or that diversity, still lived on in the whole distilling tradition, in all the gins, and then the Amaros, also in France. Gentian, in you still find it a lot in France. These aperitifs made on the basis of gentian, like Suze. It's like the old people drink it mostly. But it's somehow coming back. All the Amaros, also in cocktails, they're pretty popular. But gentian is a root that is used mainly in France and in Italy. It grows mostly pretty high in the Alps, but also in Auvergne, in Jura, in France. You find it. It's a big yellow flower. So there are different types of gentian, but the gentian that's used in beverages is the Gentiana lutea. So with the yellow flowers, and they use the root. The root, it's a plant that grows pretty old, like 30, 40 years. They dig up the roots in the wild, they dry it, and then they use it in the distillations. But people always used to also do their own infusions. So they would infuse it on alcohol or with white wine.
Right.
There are a lot of, say, bitter aperitifs also on the base of white, like vermouth. Mm-hmm. They would just make it themselves and infuse it. So we started doing some experiments, and I was really pleased with it, with the results. It often works well together with oranges. So to have this citrus element with it, you already have some bitterness then of the rind. But mostly it's always used also in combination with a lot of other herbs. But the gentian, just as the wormwood also, it has a distinct aroma too. It's not just the bitterness. With gentian, the bitterness. It's a root bitterness. So it mostly we use it in the coolship because you have the most easy and the best extraction there on the warm side. Yeah. It's also, you don't need too much of it because it can be pretty pungent, but it gives a very long aftertaste. But it's more like, it's not really, maybe it's a bit tannic, but it's this woody, long aftertaste that you have together with a distinct aroma. It colors also a bit. Then the wormwood, that's the other that we just tried, that we grow in the garden. The gentian it's not possible to grow here. So we have
to grow up high in the mountains.
Yeah. So we have to get there to France to dig it. But the wormwood we can grow here in the garden.
You just have to go down to France and go dig it up yourself.
Yep.
You do that?
Yeah.
Well, that sounds pretty fun.
I'm not sure if it's totally legal, but
no one's gonna know. It's our little secret, and everybody listening.
No, but the problem is, like, the multinationals, they get permits to harvest many tons in the wild. So I think if they get the permit, I can just take one tiny one.
Yeah.
But the wormwood, that's the other very popular herb. in, say, the 19th century, is the most famous drink of 19th century France was, of course, absinthe.
Sure.
Absinthe was made with wormwood. But the problem is if people drink absinthe now, it doesn't taste like wormwood. It tastes like anise. So I think early 20th century, it was mostly forbidden, the absinthe, because there were a lot of issues with it, psychoactive, but it's mostly because of the high alcohol. It's like 70% alcohol. And then they made an anise alternative, the Ricard, which has a very distinct, say, aroma, like the fennel anise aroma. But wormwood doesn't have that. It's much more bitter. Like anise is not really bitter, but the wormwood is extremely bitter.
Yeah.
But it has also a distinct aroma. It's not so easy to describe. There is some like these minty elements, but there's also a kind of citrus-like element to the aroma, and a very long-lasting bitterness. And we use that on the cold side in the beers, sometimes in combination with citrus fruits. We've tried different ways or different amounts, mostly infuse it in the barrel. So we have a kind of stainless pipe with holes in it. So I can fill that with all flowers. So the dried flowers, we add it in the barrel for more over a month normally. We've also done it. So I've told you we brew normally our blonde beer, but say one time a year we make some kind of oat brine. In the same way, actually, as we produce it also with raw wheat, but with then caramelized malts. And so we've also used that as a basis for, say, herbal infusion, which comes closer to some of the Italian Amaros. If you look at the color, like Cynar is a very famous one. It looks like an oat brine somehow. So, but of course, the Amaros, they're also very sweet. But in our oat brine, we still have like this hint of sweetness because of the caramelized malts. We noticed it's a beer that wasn't. Most beer lovers didn't like that at all.
No.
But most people were just more coming from a wine perspective, or just used to drink more, say the Amaros and the liquors. They were very pleased with it, and personally, we liked it a lot too. So we were making it again.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about the Mirica also? I think it's such a lovely profile, and I also enjoy how these. Normally I tend to avoid urban spice beers, but they're often in the wrong house. You know what I mean? They're in the wrong style. But then sometimes when you bring in the acidity, it somehow makes them all click and make sense. And it's like just like you're talking about a Negroni or a cocktail and sort of similar profile, and this somehow makes sense in the brain. The senses work it out better. And I don't know.
Yeah, I think I agree with you. Also, while home brewing, we know in the beginning we were very hesitant also because I didn't like herbal beers. I didn't like it at all because I would always miss the hops until it was just like one morning I wanted to brew just by myself, and I decided because we were already all doing sour or like more acidic beers, and I just wanted to see what I could find in the garden, use with it. It was a very strange brew because it started, there was a thunderstorm and I had to stop the brew, and then I started again, and it ended up very high in ABV. So it had some residual sugars, but it was also a bit acidic, and then it had the herbs, and I thought like everyone will think it's disgusting. But somehow everyone was very intrigued by it, including we were surprised with somehow the outcome. And then we noticed if you use herbs, you need some acidity. It's a totally different thing together. It makes it more drinkable. Let's say in more acidic beers, you don't need to hop so much. And then you can play both with the aroma. It's interesting to have an aroma, a distinct aroma, but also with the bitterness. The experience with the bitterness came later because it's more easy just to have your base acidic beer and then add some different aromas. If you really start using it in the boil for bitterness, say you alter somehow also, say, the backbone, the whole structure of the beer. And those experiments came later. And I prefer those now. Just in the beginning, we used mostly a lot of different herbs together, which was typical also in the Grue tradition. That was a mixture of different herbs. But now I just want to purify it a bit more. So now we just bought last week a beer with only America Gale as an addition. So we steeped it in a coolship. We've made a beer before with America Gale and a lot of other herbs together with it. I will look for a bottle if I still have one. We can try that. But now it's something that's more interesting just to have. It's also a bit of a general approach. It's always the more simple, the better. And so we're looking for just keeping things simple. Also on a process. So on the technical side, you'll see everything in the brew house is very simple. It's just flexible hoses, and it's just.
I think that there's a simplicity, a relative simplicity, or say a surprising elegance in the fermentation profile and the aroma. Because when we were talking about wild captures for an article in the February-March issue of Craft Beer and Brew magazine.
Out now to subscribers. Read Joe's long feature on Farmhouse Brewing that includes plenty of information, photos, and whatnot of Tom and Antidoot.
And Kemke in Germany, and also Eikentide in Norway, but you were talking about the wild captures for yeast. You were looking for Saccharomyces, not for bread.
Yes, yeah, that's true.
And so if you could maybe talk about why, because I think a lot of people would assume, it's a mixed ferm brewery, it's a wild brewery, it's going to be bread beers.
No. I've told you before that I'm not such a big fan, actually, of Brettanomyces. It's all, of course, it all depends on, say, the overall picture, and it has its place somehow. But with the wild captures and the wild fermentation, what matters mostly for us is the Saccharomyces, and we learned that with doing all the experiments with the wild captures. Mostly before, say, in the brewing world, a wild beer is sometimes you buy a Saccharomyces strain, and then you add a commercial bread strain to it that eats all the residual sugars. And because it's a commercial Saccharomyces strain, you still have quite some sugars left, and there's still plenty of work for the bread to work on. And so there's too much bread profile because there were too many sugars. Personally, I think, I don't know all the bread strains on the market, but in general, they're too stinky for me. And it's too heavy, and you lose all delicacy and balance in that approach. So we were just seeing what we would get with the wild captures, and we noticed it's very defining what kind of Saccharomyces does the work. So mostly in the wild fermentation, Saccharomyces doesn't get the love I think it deserves, because there's so many different strains, and you have so many different, the base character that's defined by the Saccharomyces strain. Mostly if you do wild captures, you won't find any bread. There's no, the most studies that I've seen, maybe there are different studies now, but they don't find any Brettanomyces in there. Mostly the Brettanomyces comes through the wood, comes from the barrels, it lives in the wood. Or it might be there in so small quantities that you cannot trace it in the beginning. It only comes up front when all the work by Saccharomyces is done. So I think the main character that we have in our beers is the wild Saccharomyces together with the bacteria. Then after a while...
And you're leaning towards wild Saccharomyces that is a higher attenuator that is going to dry those out before the bread gets.
We have to do all tricks to slow it down. I explained to you a bit with the different ways we do the turbid mashing. But we can just totally skip the beta amylase. We can just go straight to 74 degrees, and it will still go easily through it. So, say the general science doesn't apply, I think, for a wild Saccharomyces, because it's pretty powerful.
Yeah.
But it's also, I don't want to have too many sugars left at bottling stage. Of course, there will be an impact, say, after a few or after some time in the bottle of Brettanomyces, but I don't want to have that too strong. And it's in the beginning, because we've been discussing already, say the cocktail tradition, but the natural wine tradition is another of our big inspirations for what we do. And in the beginning, I would visit winemakers and I would tease them about Brettanomyces. Like, I have Brettanomyces on my fingers.
Sure.
And they're always like, in the wine world, they hate Brettanomyces.
Right.
And so I thought, like, it's just naive and stupid of them to hate or to be so negative about Brettanomyces. But then a few years later, I think I agree with the winemakers. Because if you want to make natural wine, I think in a good way, in the beginning, you're just looking for the funky stuff. I remember the first bottle, and I was intrigued. I was not a wine drinker. I was intrigued because I said, like, this smells like Cantillon. And that was just a total eye-opener. I started drinking wine because it smelled like Cantillon. If I drink natural wine now, I don't want it to smell like Cantillon. Right. Because it's a kind of funkiness, and often with a lot of mistakes, that has nothing to do with, say, the terroir, with where it was grown, has nothing to do with grape varieties. You somehow, if it's, say, too bacterial or too bready, you lose the typicity. And so you lose the diversity of the whole sea. Then it all tastes the same.
All tastes the same wherever it's made. Yeah. Let's talk a little bit more about that. But first, from the rotatable pickup tube on Rogue Brewing's pilot brew house to the integrated hopbacks on Sierra Nevada's twin prototyping brew houses, SS Brewtech has taken technology they invented working with world-renowned industry veterans and made them available to every craft brewer. To learn more about SS Brewtech's innovation list, head over to ssbrewtech.com. Also, if you're looking for a direct partnership with an independent hop grower who is as fanatical about flavor and quality as you are, join the revolution. Hop Revolution's only reason for being is sustainably farming and processing New Zealand's most flavorsome hops. They get that great beer is not brewed to a past or a future ideal. It's an ongoing journey of fresh thinking. Hop Revolution really is only here for your beer. Let them flavor your thinking stateside directly from Hop Revolution or through Crosby Hops or Mill 95. Learn more at hoprevolution.co.nz. It's an ongoing journey of fresh thinking. I think it makes sense to talk about beer not brewed to past or future ideals. What a on-point message right there, because that's exactly what you do. And of course, we took a second right there as we were reading to pour a beer. What is this beer that we're drinking now, Tom?
It's called Nacht van de Geit, and we brewed it with some friends, and we all started a bit around the same period. So Kemker was there, and guys from Navel in Holland, and then a guy from Sweden, Bready Fingers. I talked to you about the Brettanomyces on the fingers, so he called his brewery Bready Fingers. and then a guy from California, Altbrouw, Tim Dekker, and it was after the Carnivali Brettanomyces Festival in Holland. For us, a very important festival because
did they let you go? I mean, you're not really a Brett fan.
Yeah, but it was for us. It was always wonderful because there was a community of people all over the world that came together one time a year, and many of them were also just starting, and it was a new way of learning also, because I think we didn't learn so much from the Belgian brewers. I never did any internship at any brewery. I never brewed at any other place than our own place. But we learned from, say, other people in the same situation who were just doing experiments. And we found each other through fora on the internet, like Milk the Funk, which is a very important fora for those kind of questions. And it was wonderful to meet every year in Amsterdam, and now, after COVID, now it's finally happening again on a smaller scale this year.
It's one of my favorite festivals. It's just to kind of describe it for people. Imagine being in Amsterdam for a few days, and your plan is going to a bunch of seminars. Where you'll get to drink some beer for sure. Yeah. But it's brewers come. It's not only brewers. It's sometimes experts in a particular field or something, and then they'll give a talk. You taste some beer. of course, later everyone goes out for a beer, but it's a really cool atmosphere and feeling and community feeling, and you meet some like-minded folks.
Yeah. That's actually the most important part, just hanging out with some friends. But the cool thing is, like, it's not a beer festival in the sense that you have a big hall and everyone is just pouring their stuff. No, everyone's telling stories somehow. Some are, say, more academic experts, but a lot of just experience. You have different kind of tastings, food pairings, very anarchic, spread out over the city. And then after we decided to get together, so Sunday everyone just, the brewers, they came to our place, and then I think Monday we brewed the beer together. It was summer. It was the only beer that we've released not brewed in the cold season. So we made, for the cool ship, we made a kind of copper coil with cold water running through,
right,
so that we would get a quicker cooling. And then the next morning we transferred it to the barrels. It was the only beer that didn't acidify, or didn't really acidify on its own, surprisingly. That was very surprising, because we thought, like, we do it in summer, you will have a lot of bacteria, will have, like, going sour pretty quickly. It didn't sour
at all.
Maybe because the Miraca was the main ingredient that we used in the cool ship. It's known to be antibacterial. So it did its job, actually. But as for that beer, we blended in one other barrel that was a bit higher in acidity, because we thought, like, these herbs, it's so herbal in profile that we need some acidity to counter it, to make it more drinkable. And
how often does that happen to you? Obviously, you work in a way that there are some things, especially if you are adding herbs hot side into the cool ship, where once that happens, that's locked in. Then the only way to solve or rebalance is blending at the far end, versus cold side herb additions, where you can add taste, leave longer or add more, and kind of adjust and season as you go. And so, but certainly there are some things that work better hot side versus cold side. And so you want to do that. Talk to me a little bit about how your process works in that regard, understanding these things, and then keep continuing to adjust to make sure, because it's not just we get what we get. It is very much a process for you where you are going for a flavor and want to balance all of those pieces so that they become a very drinkable beer at the end.
It's often very much intuition based. We can adjust it. We've changed also the process for some herbs or for some ingredients. Like, for example, if we use oranges, we now always do it at the end. We never do it anymore. Before, we used to do it in the cool ship, but I think you have a much better expression if you have that at the end. So we changed that. But I think the benefit is that it's always very small scale releases that we do. So it's always 1 barrel, 2 barrels, or 3 barrels.
Sure.
That's it. We have one exception. That's say or base beer. So that's mostly a blend of 4 barrels. That's this one. That's the whoop whoop. But normally it's 1, 2 to maximum 3 barrels.
Your biggest release is 4 wine barrels worth of beer.
Yep, that's the biggest. But that makes we're pretty flexible. We don't have to decide. Sometimes we release a beer from one brew session. Like, we have a beer where we infused the prunings of the blackcurrant shrubs that we have. So in winter, if you cut the wood off, we know this is very aromatic. It smells like blackcurrant, the wood. And I start reading some things about it. In Russia, they have a tradition to use it for teas. So we first did it in a home brew, and we did it in the first year, and then we've been doing it afterward. We've been pre-boiling the mash water with the wood.
Huh.
and then getting in the morning, we get all the wood out. So like you make a tea, and with that tea you brew. And
It's a bit like doing with spruce tips or spruce wood. or something.
Yeah.
Like
I can imagine in that tradition it also happens somehow. But we did it with the blackcurrant. Of course, then you make a beer. It's actually it's meant to be released as such because it's really in the structure of the beer. With some other elements, we can still be flexible at the end. So it's mostly always we decide at the end what we do with it. What does it extra need? And then we're very flexible.
Because there is some, especially because you're only generally brewing through the winter season when it's cold enough that there's also that we've got to brew when we can and put that beer back. And, for a brewery this size, that's also a bit of a challenge because even being able to find that kind of place for the beer, you mentioned earlier while we were talking that it's a very delicate dance for you. You have a small space and you have a limited time in order to make beer and a limited space in which to age beer. And that space that you age beer is also a space where you package beer and where you store finished beer for people to pick up. And so it becomes a very, a small orchestrated piece there.
Yeah, that's true. We brew, say, between November and April. We hope to finish now in March, but we need enough cold days. It's also a bit with climate change. It's sometimes more difficult. It's not that you have like 3 months that you can always brew. So we couldn't brew for 2 weeks, and now we're brewing again at the end of the week. But it's always luckily we have like 2 stainless buffer tanks that we can use because we don't always have 3 barrels. So now I have to label so we can have free space in the bottle conditioning room, then we can bottle, and then we can fill barrels again. So it's always a bit like that. Then we also have to make sure that the releases are in the right time of the year, because the beer has to move somehow. Mostly we try to bottle condition, I think around 5 months, but for some beers it's longer, for some it's a bit shorter because we release normally with 6 different beers together. So people have a box, but that's always a bit of planning. At the same time, I'm very happy that we can work that way, because that's for me the whole concept of saison. It's seasonal, so our work in the brewery is seasonal work. That means like I'm not always a brewer. I do other things, but they're connected to the brewery. That means in March, I have to make sure I'm as good as ready in the brewery in March, because then I have to work outside. I have to get the vineyard ready. We have to plow. The pruning is in March, but that's a lot of work to get everything in a good shape for a new growing season. Then May is mostly the month where you have all the festivals and activities and so on, and June also a bit, but also at the same time in the vineyard, you have to keep things under control. They start growing very quickly. Then I have to go through the rows, and then sometimes some fruits already start, like rhubarb. We used some years quite some rhubarb to blend in with things, and then we go to cherry season. So the sour cherry, mostly the end of June, early July. We start the fruit season here with picking all those, and so in summer months more we make the fruit blends. Beginning of September is mostly the grape season, so the harvest of the grapes. This year was a bit later, but then it fell together with the apple season. So October, November is all apple season. So we pick all the apples ourselves. We try to store them for a few weeks, and then we have different pressing sessions. But we're busy with that for 2 months. And then when all the cider is in the barrels, then we can start brewing again. But it's very fun because you really live with the seasons that way. Right. And that also, it leads to a different approach also to beer. Because beer is less than a kind of industrial product made somewhere in a warehouse somewhere. It's all connected to the whole flow of the seasons.
This ties back into the conversation we had with Werner from Drie Fonteinen, where he was saying the same thing. Brewing was the winter work of the farm. And that is very much expressed right here, where brewing is your winter work and farming is your summer work. Yeah.
And cider is the autumn work.
And cider is the autumn work. Yeah. Let's talk about that cider, a little bit. Now you make both of these. You make beer and cider simultaneously and seek out that kind of natural method for your cider as well. Talk to me about the creative inspiration for that, and also balancing, like we were talking earlier with natural wine. There's an interesting challenge to not destroying the character of the fruit ingredient with the process that you use through that fermentation. With apples, that can be a similar thing. You could very easily create cider that is just about the funk and with that ferments to fully dry and eliminates all the sugar in those apples and leaves you with very little left. Talk to me about making wild focused cider in a way that also captures character from the apple ingredients.
I think for ourselves there's not a real difference in making beer, cider or wine, and the main thing I think that connects it together is the search for simplicity, to keep it simple, but also pure. So we don't want, say, some microorganisms to dominate it all, because then you lose the balance.
Right.
But it was just very logical that we would just do cider, because I think I tried to explain that we try to also in the brewing, we try to stay hands-on for everything that we do. So to grow as much as we can. What we cannot grow is the barley and the wheat. So we for the beer we still rely on that. With the apples, we can just harvest all stuff ourselves. So we never buy any apples. They're all self-harvested here, but also like old orchards that are they're always high grafted trees, and it's not interesting. So it's always very old varieties that are very resistant. But then we
high graft.
Yeah, so they're grafted at a height of 2 meters.
Okay,
and so they grow like really high, big trees. But the roots go also much deeper. When you see the plantations, they're grafted very low.
Right.
So they're easy to pick. The roots don't go deep. They're with a lot of trees on a small surface. But you see
those apple orchards where they've got very thick trunks but very small, low trees. For that same reason.
That's everywhere year round.
Yeah.
We refuse to use any of those apples because it's just sugar water. If you press that, there's no character.
Yeah.
The benefit where we noticed the old varieties, they were planted because you can store them very long. Now they want a very thin skin. They want it very sweet, just the eating apples. But they're not interesting to make cider with. The old varieties, I guess they're higher in acidity, which makes them, you can store them longer. A lot of the varieties that were planted here, I know you can just store them in a bag in the stable till April.
Really?
And they keep well.
6 months and...
You don't need anything. You don't need any refrigerator or... you can just store them in the stable. But that's because it's all different type of apple.
Right.
And then we learned somehow, I think in the beginning we didn't know so much about cider. So we were just looking after the Normandy style cider, which is like the most known here in Europe, which is really heavy on the apple flavor. It's really kind of farmhouse cider with often quite a lot of Brettanomyces, which makes it a bit heavy. So they have the residual sugars and they have a great apple aroma, but they're pretty heavy to drink. They don't have the freshness. But then I think we adapted. We learned to make them more in tune with our beers. And I think in general, a lot of the beer lovers, they appreciate that because it just really fits really well with the flavor that we're also looking for the beer. So that means they're a bit higher in acidity than the general ciders. They're also a bit higher in alcohol. And that means that they go more in the direction of some of the pet nuts. So the natural pétillance, so the sparkling wines that are a bit made lower in alcohol, so it's say 8% and a bit higher acidity, they go into the direction of sparkling wine. And that's what we like to drink ourselves. Those kind of ciders, they're easy drinking. And that's why we also, because it just fits in also with the season, at the same time that we're pressing apples, we're also pressing the wines. Because we've macerated, say, the grapes for 2 weeks, then we have some tanks. And so we add mostly the skins of all the grapes to the cider. We're not purists just in the sense that we say like, no, you should only be able to taste the apple. It's not like that. Let's say we use herbs and fruits on the beer too. But we want to have a clean, say, base character of the cider. We want a good fermentation. But it adds tannins. Like we add the herbs for the beers to structure it. So we use the grape skins to structure the cider. Because in the typical cider areas, they have bitter apples. They have cider apples that are specifically meant for making cider. They are bitter. This is something we don't have here. But instead, in the beginning, we drove to Normandy to get some bitter apples. But then we said, no, we have to do it another way. And that's what we decided. We're going to use the grape skins. And so now we use all the grapes.
Because you have them here and you're growing your own
we have
grapes
them here. We're pressing. Yeah. It's very logical to use it all together. And so this year, most of the barrels that we saw there, we added some of the wine. Because the wine, we don't release the wine as such because the volume is not so high. And it's for us more interesting to blend it with the beer or with the cider.
So you make wine with the grapes here that you're growing
in your backyard. We first make the wine.
But you don't release wine as a standalone thing. No. It only finds its way into blends with your beer and your cider. Interesting. Because
let's say with the volume that we have, there are so many good wines made also not so far from here. Let's say the Mosel, which is one of the best places for Riesling, is a 2-hour drive. Or say Beaujolais, Shiraz, like 5-hour drive, and you have fantastic wines. There's no need, say, to compete with that. But there are not so many people who are just making these blends with cider and beer, and it's something where we can just do our thing.
Yeah. Well, let's as we're getting on here, let's zoom out a little bit and talk about the big picture. You know, for you and for Antidoot, what's the goal? And what does success look like for you?
The goal is very simple. Just to keep doing what we do. Just to have fun in what we do. That's actually the most important. And to keep the freedom to do what we want. To not look too much to say this the outside world or the market or whatever. We just want to keep the freedom to make what we want in a pleasant and beautiful setting. So we always hope to grow some more stuff like that. That's also something that my wife really likes to help with out. So all the prunings of the trees, and so we have another. We haven't go there. We didn't go there, but at the other side of the road, we have another plot where we planted also a little vineyard and some fruit trees. I think our idea of expansion is not to make more bottles, but just to grow more stuff ourselves.
Yeah,
that's it.
Beautiful. Beautiful.
So success is a year with good fruit.
Well, I hope that the climate agrees with you, and you have a fantastic harvest this year. On that note, let's call it to a close. For nearly 30 years, G&D Chillers has set the mark for quality equipment you can rely on. BSG sources hops directly from growers and processes them in their FSSC certified facility. Think outside the puree box with Old Orchard's craft concentrate blends. Get detailed insights into your fermentations with Brew Monitor risk-free. Put SS Brewtech's advances to work in your brew house, and try New Zealand's most flavorful, sustainably farmed hops from Hop Revolution. Of course, if you enjoy this podcast every week, we would love your support. Go to beerandbrewing.com, click on the subscribe button, and vote with your dollars. No, thank you all who listen and subscribe for making it possible for us to do things like come to Belgium and talk to inspiring brewers and share some of their approaches with you. It's your support that helps us make that happen. We appreciate it. Tom, thank you for joining us on the podcast.
Pleasure. Yeah.
If people want to learn more about Antidoot, finding your beer, because you don't make very much of it, is not necessarily the easiest thing. But where do people find you and find Antidoot or find your beer in the general world?
On our website, we have a list of places, mostly in Europe, of where to drink our beer. So there's a range of restaurants, I think in most of the neighboring countries, and in Belgium, of course. There are bars and restaurants spread out over Belgium. And
you have a membership club that occasionally opens up to some new members here or there, but it's still a little hard to get into.
Yeah, we're full.
It's a good problem to have.
Yeah.
What's the website or what are you on social media?
It's just antidoot.be.
And that's ANTIDOOT.
That's right. Yeah.
I think we didn't get quite enough from the philosophy professor. I wonder if he could explain the double meaning of the name for people.
That's true. What's the double meaning?
The double meaning is antidote. The word also exists, of course, in English as a kind of counter poison. People ask me counter poison to what? I think it's mostly the old to modern approach. I think the issues that I have with modernity as such, it's that it's always focused. I think we're still very modern as a society, is that it's a virtual program. So if we look at Descartes, it's I think, therefore I am. That's a virtual thing. They say we think there's life in the virtual, and we discard the whole, say, material side. I think even the whole craft scene is still completely locked up in that virtual paradigm. Maybe not so much a home brew, but in general, I think it's very recipe driven, for example. A recipe is a virtual thing. I think what we do, for us, it's not about the recipe. The recipe is not important. We can give the recipe to everyone and everyone will make something different. It's much more about it, what I think in the wine world they call terroir. But I mean that in a very, say, broad, it's not just the soil. It's just the whole installation, the setting. That's why you see we try to create a kind of vibe in the brewery. So like scientifically, this doesn't make sense, maybe. But I think it's very important. It's material. That's also why we have to do it. We don't rent a brewer or have a brewer. No. We have to do the brewing because it has to be our hand to shape it into a personal product. And it all connects to the material side. I think if we would just grow and would go out to a warehouse somewhere on an industrial, it would be a totally different product. So that's which we really tried to think in terms of, say, the material connection to it, which is much more important than, say, a recipe or a concept. Then the other word is dat. Antidoot. Dood in Dutch, it means death. Death.
Yes.
Yeah. So it's
debt would mean owing people money.
So we're
but death.
Also against that.
Yeah. Also, we don't want to be in debt, but it's about life.
Yeah.
It's about the way we want to live. But there's no direct access. So that means we have to go through the material. Say the skull. For Hegel, he has an expression like the spirit. Spirit is a bone. It has to materialize, and you have to go through the opposites. So you have to go through that. You have to go through the hard work. There's no direct access. You cannot just. You have to go through the sour. You have to go through the bitter. There's no direct. The sweet is the illusion of the direct access to the good. That's the Disney version. That's the pastry stout. But we have to go through the sour and bitter.
To get to the sweetness of life.
Yeah. And then the
Nice.
seasonality, of what you do and the rhythm to what you do lives out that same, philosophy of life and death through the seasons.
Yeah.
Things grow, things are harvested, things die, things grow again, and it echoes that entire focus on life and moving through.
That's the compost pile. Huh?
Yeah. Well, on that note, Tom, thanks for joining us on the podcast.
Pleasure.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thank you, Tom.
This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew.